Hey everybody, welcome to part 4 of day 2 lecture video. We're going to go over a little bit more about dough and yeast in dough. But first I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the mixing method that y'all are going to be using primarily in this class when you are making dough, and that's the straight dough mixing method. Now we know that we have other doughs that take a little bit more time, and some of them even take days because we have wonderful things like pre-ferments that go in there, and we have to feed those and cultivate our yeast and make sure that it has everything that it needs to be successful. So we're providing it that proper environment so that fermentation and things of that nature can be done appropriately. But for you guys, the straight dough mixing method is our primary mixing method in this class. And what that entails is you taking all of your wet ingredients and you're dumping all of your dry ingredients on top of it. Then you're fitting a dough hook on top of on your mixer, and you're turning it on and you're letting that start to knead the dough. So with the help of Bubble Yum, my mouth is going to be the mixer. The gum is the dough, and we need it. We need it. We need it until the gluten strands are formed. And then we're going to take a piece of that dough. After the dough starts climbing up the dough hook, the bowl is nice and clean because all of the doughs kind of come together. It's climbed up the dough hook. It looks nice and smooth. We rip off a piece of that dough and we stretch it between our fingers. We're looking for a baker's window. If that baker's window is formed, you'll see the gluten strands kind of nicely interwoven throughout. You'll be able to hold it up to the light and you'll be able to see through it like you're looking through a sheer curtain. And then the yeast will start eating carbohydrates in the dough. And I'll start doing this to the gluten strands. Until I come around, knock it down, redistribute the food sources to the yeast. And then I'll start that process all over. Of course, there would not be enough a reason to knead again because all the gluten strands are already formed in the way that we need them to be formed at this point because it's allowing the CO2 to be trapped. So that's how yeast starts acting in dough. Okay, and certain doughs are different than other doughs. We've got lean dough and we've got rich dough. We know that lean dough is made up of 4 ingredients and only 4 ingredients. They are water, flour, yeast, and salt. And these 4 ingredients in different ratios and with different fermentation times give us hundreds of different kinds of dough. And that dough turns into hundreds of different kinds of bread. And then sometimes we'll take up a piece of one loaf of dough, or one batch of dough rather, and we'll hold on to it and we'll put it into a new dough. And that's called a pâte fermentée. And we use that a lot of times when we're making baguettes. And then there's times when we just go straight and bake the dough off. And a lot of times when we're doing that, we're using rich doughs. We're dealing with rich doughs. So rich doughs are different than lean doughs in that they have something outside of those 4 ingredients added in, and a pretty substantial amount too sometimes. So let's say brioche. Well, brioche has flour and it's got yeast and it has salt and it has milk and it has eggs and it has butter and it has sugar. It's got a lot of things added to it. And so the addition of those other ingredients not only makes it a rich dough, it also elongates the shelf life of the dough. So a lean dough has a very short shelf life, roughly 4 to 6 hours, whereas a rich dough has a shelf life between 6 and 12, still not seeming very long, really. So how can you buy bread at the store? Those have been enriched with something else, something preservative of some kind. But rich doughs have preservatives in them naturally too. It comes from the fat and it comes from the sugar, those moisturizing ingredients. They coat those starch molecules and they protect the product from going rancid and stale. Okay, so it has well, not necessarily rancid because butter does go rancid, but the fact that the starch molecules are coated is the primary thing that we're talking about when we're talking about the aging of a bread loaf or the shelf life of a bread loaf. We don't want them to have we don't want the starch to be getting hit with oxygen so quickly, because that's what's pulling moisture out. Okay, so when we have butter and eggs and milk and sugar added, that's coating those starch molecules and preventing that excessively quick aging process. Okay, so let's talk about different kinds of examples of lean dough as opposed to rich dough. So we know that brioche would be considered a rich dough because it has all those extra added ingredients, cinnamon rolls, let's see, all the ooey gooey stuff would be considered a rich dough. Laminated dough, so Danish croissant, those types of doughs, they would all be considered enriched. And then lean doughs would be things like your sourdough or your baguette or ciabatta and all of that fun stuff that doesn't have those ingredients that are going outside of those 4 ingredients. Okay. The recommended liquid for a lean dough is always water. Obviously, it's water because that's one of the 4 ingredients. But other liquids can be used in dough. Obviously, we use milk a lot of the time. Sometimes we use juice in dough. When I'm making my sourdough starter, and remember, sourdough is considered to be a lean dough. When I am making my sourdough starters, I start with pineapple juice, which is kind of interesting, but it attracts yeast in that first stage when it's still in its barm phase, and that's the very beginning phase of a sourdough becoming a sourdough. And after it gets going and it starts to grow and there's enough yeast in there, and I'm feeding the yeast by taking some of my barm out and putting some flour in to replace that and giving it a little bit more water. As time goes by, it really takes that pineapple and just kind of, eventually it's gone. But initially, that pineapple juice is attracting yeast because, of course, it's an extra source of sugar to feed the yeast. So it's kind of cool in and of that whole process, and it allows for fermentation to begin. So it gives a nice flavor, a nice starting flavor to my barm / sourdough mother starter. Okay, so again, water, milk, and juice, they act the same way in bread that they do in cake and other things. So they have a thinning effect on the coagulation of starches and the gelatinization of proteins. So we're always mindful of that when we're thinking of the structure and the texture that we want to be getting from our internal crumb inside of our bread. So what's the difference between a dough versus a batter? I'll tell you. A dough is more stable and a batter is more fluid. A batter can pour while a dough cannot. So when we're making quick bread, which is like pumpkin bread or banana nut bread, that's more of a batter than a dough, but we're still making a bread. Okay, when we're making cookie dough, that's more stable than a batter, but it's still making cookies. So that's how it's not just going to be going towards bread necessarily or towards cake necessarily with these terms. Sometimes they kind of cross over, but we want to be talking about the same thing. We want to be using our terminology appropriately. Okay? So the next thing I want from you guys, we're supposed to have in this lecture a discussion about kitchen equipment. And I really, really, really want you guys to actually access this part of your PowerPoint because it goes over pieces of equipment that we have in our kitchen that we utilize every single day, but I want you to see what it looks like so you know what I'm talking about. So the deck ovens look different than our rotary oven. The deck oven, you actually have decks. It's steam injected to get moisture to your bread for oven spring and all those wonderful things. We'll talk more about that in another lecture. You also have the proofer that's in our kitchen that looks just like a cabinet that's closed, but it has these little buttons on the front of it. So I want y'all to look at that and really get to know what it's supposed to be used for, and that it's not just a little closed cabinet that I like to stick a rolling rack into. We actually utilize it for good purposes. And then what the rotary looks like, the rotary oven looks like, how it's different from our deck oven. You also see that in our kitchen we have a dough sheeter. And the dough sheeter basically rolls out your dough. So I want you to know what that looks like. It's a really big piece of equipment. You can actually hurt yourself pretty bad on it. So I want you to really be mindful of what it looks like so that we can go over the pros and cons of it when we get back together and when we go to use them. And then we've got different kinds of mixers. I want you to know that all of the mixers that we have in our kitchen are vertical mixers. We do not have a horizontal mixer, and we do not have a spiral mixer. Now, spiral mixers and horizontal mixers are for large quantities of dough. Horizontal mixers are for the largest quantity of dough that we can possibly make, and those are primarily used at big manufacturing companies. But a spiral mixer, you may actually use that. And what I want you to know about that is that it has an ability to break down your gluten strands. It can overwork your dough too quickly. And when the dough gets overworked, it can break down those gluten strands and cause it, and once that happens, you can't come back from that. Thomas. So once that happens, you can't come back from it. And then I want you to look over the pictures of what a dough hook looks like. I want you to see what a paddle looks like, and I want you to see what a whisk looks like so that you know what we're talking about when I talk about those things in class 2. And then again, it goes over the ovens, and you want to know that a deck oven is heating from the bottom upward. Your convection oven has 2 fans that spin in opposite directions, and it really forces the heat transfer to the food. They're 10 to 15% hotter than your normal deck oven. So they're not necessarily the best oven in the world for baking, but we do have a tendency to bake in them when that's all that's available to us. So when that happens, we need to remember that we have to actually crank down the temperature 10 to 15% from what it's actually asking us to be baking at. And there it goes into the proofer. You want to also be sure to take notes of what is in those bullets on the PowerPoint, where it's saying that a proofer should be between 80 and 105 degrees. You want to take note of that. And you also want to make sure that your humidity is between 85 and 95% humidity when you're using that. It's going to make a lot more sense when we actually get into the kitchen and start making bread. A baker's balance beam scale. I want y'all to learn what all of those things are. You probably learned about that in Introduction to Culinary Arts, or you're about to learn about it in Introduction to Culinary Arts. It's balancing off of one another. So you would put your weights on one side and your ingredients to be weighed on the other. And then when they balance, you're ready to use your product. It means it's measured out properly. So that is it for day 2. Man, I'm glad that was a quick one. We will be having more lecture videos that are going to come available on Monday, and some more that will be available for you guys by Wednesday. Just make sure that y'all are keeping up with getting all of your assignments done and turned in, and that you don't fall behind, because there's always more to come, and I don't want y'all to fall behind. And yeah, that's it. So the next time that we're talking, we're going to be on to day 3 lecture, and I promise you it's not as long as this one.